So you are?
Joseph O'Donnell. His brother Charles, a descendant of Edgar O'Donnell, who was a son of Peter Anthony O'Donnell, who was the son of Anthony O'Donnell, who originally came from Ireland in 1851, right? Yeah, yes. 1851. And they were 5.5 years before this island was known to them, because it was the center of King Strang's operation. When it was known that a place in the United States that would remind them of Ireland, particularly Ironmore, they were ecstatic, absolutely ecstatic. When they got here, it was really Tierna No, which was the Irish view of paradise, going back to pre-Christian times. That is, paradise was the west of the sunsets. And this was really paradise for them, because first coming this country, or to the west, they landed in Quebec. Their time here would have been much better than it had in Ireland. There was food here, but tremendous persecution, tremendous problems of people coming in. They'd be mostly very unskilled as far as any trades. Very limited English. Many of them wouldn't speak any English at all. Trying to support and raise a family on very, very limited income. And they found that discrimination here was just about as bad as it had been in Ireland with the employers. And that's the problem resulting. See, there were no unions, nothing like this to protect the workers. Very, very little concern. If an Irishman died, you can just get another Irishman. So the problems that they would have encountered before coming here would have been just about as bad as Ireland, which except they would have some food. And they would have had relations here, or part of the Irish community that could help them if they got in trouble. Fortunately, that didn't exist in Ireland because nobody had anything, really. In fact, when Anthony O'Donnell left, the poverty in Ireland was so much, this is even before them, that in 1837, a survey was made in the town of Quidor, which is the mainland, just a little bit up the coast from Ironmore. But the economic conditions would have been exactly the same as Ireland. There were 9,000 people in the area, a total of 10 beds for 9,000 people. There were 93 chairs. This is the physical things of a home. Now, can you imagine a home, the homes didn't even have tables or chairs. They sat on the floor, they ate on the floor. They slept in the part of the homes were very, very small. The whole family on nothing but a bunch of straw, all huddled together. That's poverty, let me tell you. So that was the reason the name of the booklet turned out, oh, the paradise. See, this really was a paradise for them, because here, when they came, my God, Mormons were vacating, they got houses already built, completely finished. Land, wow, you could have 100 acres here if they wanted. No price, no landlord. Oh, it really was heaven to these poor people.
Do you know where Anthony settled when he first emigrated to Beaver?
Yes, he settled, he landed in Quebec. Now, the reason for coming to Quebec was that the passage from Ireland was about £1 cheaper, and £1 was a lot of money then. The passage would be something like £5 to Quebec. This was being paid to the landlord, and the reason for him being paid this is the English government figured that the poverty in Ireland should be financed by landlords. So if any person on his estate were to go to the poorhouse, the landlord was taxed for that expense. Well, after a short time, he'd have more than £5 passage to the States. So this Mr. Charlie who had just bought the island, adventure, as he can, when the price was low, these things were so bad. He knew that the only way he could make a financial successful venture on Ironmore was to get rid of half the people. And that was the starting of getting this mass eviction. Providential, but very difficult on people. So when Anthony left in 1851, Ireland, it was near the end of the famine, but not the end of the poverty. He had left with his wife and small child who was just 6 weeks old. Now the reason he had to leave so disastrously, because when the people were evicted, their homes were just crashed. No place to go back to. This was the landlord's effort to cut down the number of people on his estate so that if there'd be less people with the poorhouse, really, that's what it amounted to. It was a business venture, that's all. let's see.
They made it to Quebec.
Oh, and they landed in Quebec. They were 5.5 years traveling between Quebec, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and different points in Pennsylvania. This wasn't only Anthony, this was a whole group. So they were going for employment. If somebody was digging a ditch somewhere, that's where they went. And which means you dragged your family along and lived in any hovel you find. And in the process, let's see, in the early days, in the 5.5 years, I believe there he lost 4 children, if I'm not mistaken. Young children, babies died. And the total amount of children that died, he had 13 children, and only 6 of them survived to adults. Quite astounding. That was very, very common, particularly among the Irish community, because where they're living, the tenements are little houses. They were literally crowded in, something like they were in Ireland. See, they were used to nothing. If you had to sleep on the floor, slept on the floor. And those are ideal conditions, see, for typhus, cholera, and everything. Sanitation. You couldn't help diseases. So these people were dying just with no control, really, and no medical assistance to mount anything. From there, in 1856, King James Strang was shot by his own people. Johnny O'Donnell, who was Johnny Threat, was in business with John Boner, as I recall. They had a small stick trading it on the lakes. They fished some, traded some. Johnny was Sophia O'Donnell's sister. Sophia was wife of Anthony. So he's the one that discovered Beaver Island. The Indians came and told him that King Strang had been shot. Well, naturally, King Strang was shot. The community became extremely fearful that they were going to be driven off the island. The full-scale war would break out because they had been discriminating against the Irish and all the Indians. They didn't really want anybody on this island. They really came. I suppose it would have been a battle had the Mormons not left. So it really, these homes were just left, the people left in an awful big hurry. Kind of sad in a way. The Mormons were good people. It's just that this King Strang was a very difficult person and very, very much overpowering. So much so that his own community was left almost helpless. He had all this issues for him, even to the point of the type of clothing they were wearing. In fact, that aggravated some women. They didn't like the extreme long shoot or dresses and big, old-fashioned boots for women. But that was minor. At any rate, the community was left leaderless, and they panicked. Yeah. So, let's see, how were we?
So by 1855, 56, Anthony was on his way to Beaver Island.
Absolutely, right away, and ecstatic. Those people you can see, receiving a message someplace to remind you of Aaron Moore. Now, it's hard to see offhand, while in extreme poverty in Ireland, why he would be attracted to a place that would look like Aaron, that would remind him of Aaron Moore. Aaron Moore, at least when they had food before the potato fell, even they had nothing but very low material things, no prospect of bettering their lives. They had probably more than maybe we have today. They had an awful strong family cohesion, tremendous love and family, tremendous concern for each other. Not only your immediate family, but anybody on the island. See, going back far enough, and you wouldn't have to go back far. All related. As it is here today, when you start doing the genealogy, you might think, that person, my cousin, or second cousin, or whatever. See, it's just like yourself. You're related to us as much as either of us, but you don't have the name because you're descendant of Richard, who was the eldest child of Anthony, who was brought to here as a 6-week-old baby. That is when she left Ireland. Tremendous. Can you imagine caring for a young child like that? On the boat trips were just atrocious. The courts were hardly ever clean, People were just stuffed in little cubbyholes. Some of them were converted slave ships, and that's what the berths they were sleeping in. Just stuffed in little cubbyholes. They'd have maybe a space 6 foot long for 4 hours. And just have space. I mean, this was what, and sometimes wouldn't let you deck if there was anything dangerous. You spent those 6 weeks or so below deck, wrapped in with tremendous stench, just because there was sanitary conditions. So,
getting back to when they reached Beaver Island, do you know where they lived, where they set up a homestead?
Yes, we do know. We haven't seen the cabin. It was just a ways out of town. Later on, his son built a home right on the main street here. It was since burned down. A fine home, really. First family. But also, let's see. I think it's pretty close to the old Malloy's Meat Market, just right across the street from that.
You remember what year that burned down? You know,
let's see. The exact year, I don't know, but it was when the family was in Detroit. So let's see. I'd say about 1930. That indication employment was diminishing here. Fishing was getting less, lumber was almost all gone. Anybody wanting any permanent employment had to migrate. They had no choice. So our part of the family headed for Detroit. Some of the families headed for Chicago. That's the reason for the big community in Chicago. It wasn't that they wanted to go, but they had to go. But at least they were going to more jobs, which was tremendous. Now, Minnie O'Donnell, she also followed her children here. It's Marianne O'Donnell, Maloney O'Donnell, because she wanted to be with the kids. So my dad did, when he was 19 years old, design and built a fine home for them. Tremendous thing for a young person to do.
A home in Detroit.
The home in Detroit, yes. Yeah, for the family. But nevertheless, her heart was always on Beaver Island. You could look at, read some of her old poems and they almost cry. This is where her heart was, see. This was her home. She was kind of a displaced person in Detroit, even though she was hungry and had everything, but this is what she longed for. And she went back, had her home not burned. They rented it while it was gone, or while they were gone.
And Anthony's son, Peter, will be your grandfather. What did he work?
You mean Anthony?
Or excuse me, Peter.
Oh, Peter's my grandfather, right. And Anthony, the great-grandfather.
Right. Peter worked at what here on the island?
Peter worked for the lumber people, the lumber interests, as a I suppose you'd say carpenter, mostly building railroad cars and repairing the railroad cars. That's part of the wood in those days. Later, when lumber started deteriorating, he went to work for the lumber interests in just outside of Manistee. And he worked there a number of years, would come back and forth. You know, his lumber is a bit seasonal there too. And died quite young. Let's see. The exact date I don't have in mind, I'd have to look at my book. But his children were all very young, which means then that his wife, Minnie, then had the responsibility of raising 5 children, her children, and supporting them. Quite a task, but by God, she was up to it.
And how did she support them?
She opened home as a boarding house, took in lots of boys. She also taught school some of the time, and she opened a small store in front of her house.
A can store, is that right?
Yes, a can store. And I strongly suspect that the islands helped too, but helped in very, very clever ways. Now, for example, my dad is just a very young boy, I mean a young boy, would work for example, the Shing family when putting ice in the winter. And he paid a good wage for that. Of course, it was quite seasonal, you know, it wouldn't last that long. Doing things that a kid do, like going up the ramp here and bringing the clasp, see the grab the block of ice, the kids passed it. Well, an adult could keep up to that. By good for a day work, they paid like a day's wages. Quite remarkable. See, but that's just a clever way of supporting the family. Well, getting the appearance, okay, this is a handout. So this was a good place to pour in, let me tell you. But as a result of that, growing up here with the influence of a community that cares about people, one strong thing that was always evident of my dad's tremendous compassion for anybody that's hurting. I mean, really, just if he could help in any way, he just helped. Just, that was it. No decision to make, no matter what he had, he helped. And so many of the players were like that. You know, just, so hardships, while they can be difficult, can be great learning experience too. Yeah, and that's part of the same community too. You know, maybe I could mention too, as a small boy, I came with my dad to the island a number of times because he was back and forth. And he would introduce me to so many people. This is my relative, this is your cousin, but God, the names were hopelessly intertwined. I mean, you wouldn't know up from down. For a guy about 8 years old, you just get in despair. I mean, there's no way you could make sense of it. So as a result of that, I figured when I was old enough, I was going to do something along the geological line. That is to try to make sense out of all this. Well, when I was in my early 20s, I spent the longest while at with all the old letters Charlie Elliott left. I had finally up in hope and despair. I mean, how could, you know, one person you mentioned here, the next place is Nick Kane, it's the same guy. It was really a nightmare. You'd have to be an islander to do that. That's why I was so impressed with the work that your son piece and others done. They were able to ferret out this information and make sense out of it. Which way to start is a nightmare. Let me tell you, you have to try it to see. So when I started doing the research, the genealogy, it finally came to me that these good people had done the work. They had done the hard work. So all I had to supply was history, particularly history of early Elderville. So that people would understand They seen the qualities the Irish people had. That wasn't strange. That was something they always had. Their helpfulness, their concern for one another. The fact that in old Ireland, nobody ever went hungry. Nobody. It's impossible. If anybody needed medical care, they got it. And they had good medical care in ancient Ireland. If they needed legal help, they got legal help. It's just a tremendous, tremendous culture. It's seen up with centuries of that. Really goodness. So much so that when St. Pat come to Ireland as a slave, understand, as a slave, he was still impressed with the Irish. That's what made him want to make him come back. See, he knew that there was goodness here. That just with Christianity, it blossomed. And it did blossom. And maybe I should get sidetracked just to say the big difference that St. Patrick made coming to Ireland. Before St. Patrick came, the Irish, like many, many early cultures, extremely warlike, intertribal warfare all the time. Raiding neighboring communities, raiding neighboring, raiding England, raiding Scotland. They even had a section of France under their control. That was their achievement to nail the 9 hostages, was an lineage in that. Nail had an Ireland that included Scotland, a good part of England, and part of Brittany. That's where Nail was killed. By an Irishman, incidentally. Somebody that, anytime you're engaged in warfare, you get a lot of enemies. One of his enemies killed the brats. Well, anyway, let's see. Get back to my train of thought. Let's see.
You were talking about Irish culture and how its traditions carried on through the
Oh yes, okay.
You know.
Well, at any rate, St. Patrick was so impressed with the Irish, even as a slave, he wanted to come back. Of course, he supposedly had visions when he was finally, he just walked away from slavery. And at that time, if you walked away from a slave, you were identifiable by the clothing you had. They knew who you were. And he still walked about 200 miles to get to the shore, and he made it. See, God's hand was with him, that's all. So at any rate, due to St. Patrick's influence, intertribal warfare stopped, not completely, but greatly diminished. Just amazing what happened. And there was almost like massive conversions in Ireland. It was the hand of God. God wanted this to happen for a reason. And maybe this might be an interesting note too. It's going back, but it's our family's involvement with St. Patrick. Now this is something I just learned. St. Patrick, do you want me to carry a little bit on St. Patrick?
I'd actually like to get closer
to
Beaver Island.
Okay, we'll stay on St. As fascinating as it is.
You talked about Peter dying young.
Yes.
And your grandmother raising the kids and being a school teacher.
Right.
And is it true that she taught school on Garden Island as well?
Yes, she taught school several years in Garden Island. And my dad went there, because he was just a kid. I mean, he probably was first to second grade that he went. He and his younger brother Walter went with her because she couldn't leave them at home. They were far too young. And on Garden Island, it was an Indian school, strictly Indians. I mean, there were no other white children there. And as a result, my dad learned to speak Indian.
Is that right?
And sing, God, remember, he did sing the nicest Indian songs, you know, for children's songs. And God, they were good. It's too bad I can't remember the names. Simple little nature songs, but they had bouncy little tunes, you know, and catchy phrases for kids. Well, just like kids the world over, you know. And then later in life, he was a volunteer at one of our veterans' hospitals, Allen Park Veterans Hospital. And occasionally when they'd get an Indian that needed advanced medical treatment, they would ship him to this hospital because it was big. And he'd usually be able to ferret those Indians out as they were coming in, and he'd greet them in Indian and talk to them in Indian. Simple conversations, understand, but they would go from a fear situation to, okay, I got somebody I can talk to here. Yeah. So
your father remembered that language
oh yes,
well into
all
your
his
own
life.
life.
Enough for a simple conversation, yeah. And his time in coming here, the Indians, he always had a tremendous relationship because he went to school with some of them. And it's like any school bonds where your kids, see, when the Indians on Garden Island were later brought or moved here because, see, there weren't many people there, he knew all them kids. Mm-hmm. So God, when he was coming back, I mean, he visited the Indians as much as he had visited his own relatives. They just expected it, you know. And an interesting thing about Mamie Maloney, The Indians, not only the Indians, the Irish would do the same thing. They could get into some pretty wicked brawls sometimes. I mean, really. Quite life-threatening brawls. The Indians, over an argument, they might get in a fight with axes, for example, if they were chopping wood and somebody insulted the other person. These were violent things. And being that the Indian community wasn't far from where Mamie O'Donnell's home was, somebody would immediately run and get Mamie. Immediately. And to come and stop the fight. And she was the only one who could stop it, I suppose. That's kind of a strong person she was. She had come within earshot of the Indians and called out their names like a schoolmaster could only do. And they'd just freeze. Just like they were little children all over again, see? And that stopped the fight. Isn't that interesting? But she was up to it, I tell you. If they didn't stop, she'd wade right into it. I mean, she was a strong lady. You'd have to be strong. Just, you know, to raise the four wild boys. Most of them were wild, except our dad. No, he was one of the wildest. Yeah.
You were about 12 when your grandmother passed away.
Exactly.
So you have personal memories of her. You remember her?
Yes. Yes, very, very, very well. An extremely organized lady, extremely centered in what she was. I mean, if she had a goal, this was it. Later in life, her health wasn't that good, so she might give the impression of being a bit stern. But see, that comes from being a schoolmistress at the time. And when you're one person's school, you better be a disciplinarian or you're going to go crazy. I mean, and as a result of having 4 boys to raise, they were just like most boys, maybe a little more on the wild side, except Patrick, the oldest one. They were just natural boys. And then this is something I want to investigate a little further because this is something my dad told me. Maybe O'Donnell, or maybe Maloney's people were from Mayo. And most of the islanders here were from Donegal. And he says there was a vast difference between the two. The Mayo people were much more straight-laced, much more centered, they were more serious in life. So they undoubtedly looked down on the people from Donegal, because the people from Donegal, in their mind, were very irresponsible. I mean, they were just kind of live for today people. You know, if you had enough money to live today, you were doing well. And you might spend it all, you know, but a total contrast from the people of Mayo. It's still kind of like that in Donegal today too, I would say. More freedom. You can almost see it on the people's faces. I mean, they're just like they're set free. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But, but there was quite a difference. So that I want to investigate a little bit more.
And your grandmother's family, there were a couple teachers, correct? Your grandmother's brother, John T. Maloney, was a teacher as well, was he?
They did have a very strong educational bent, but understand, then you could be a teacher with 8 grades in school.
True.
You know, you didn't, but they still had that educational bent. Even my dad, he only went to school for 8 grades, but invariably, people would ask him what university attended. Is that something? And it's because he read all his life. He just had that, oh God, he read all his spare time. And what an inspiration for kids growing up. Because he gets so excited with what he's reading, and you had to pay attention to him. I mean, you just had no choice. And some of it was really great stuff. So his interests were wide, and he could, tremendous memory. God, he could recite battles and recite the movement of troops and animated all the time. Then he might break into a song. He was tremendously entertaining. God, just gifted, but with only 8 grades in school. So the teachers here, they deserve an awful lot of credit, I tell you. Just outstanding. They've done a super job.
Did he receive 8 grades of schooling on Garden or here or both?
Well, there'd be about 2 on Garden Island and the rest here with the nuns on Beaver Island.
At the McKinley School, probably.
Yes. Although when he left school, the nuns knew why. See, he was going to help bring in some money for the family, which was a necessity. They did give him permission to come and take any books out of the library, whenever he wanted to. See, that was quite a nice thing to do. But it wasn't long before after that. He arrived in Detroit when he was about 16 to find employment.
And is your father the one that ended up founding the machine shop or manufacturing?
Yeah, he had a small machine shop, yeah. Yeah. Doing quite intricate work, really. He was a very, very gifted person, really. Now, he did, in addition to his schooling, he did go to, he was in the first class at Highland Park of the Henry Ford Trade School, which were super. Now, they were just strictly organized on trade, mathematics and the skills of running machines and that type of thing. But being that he picked up things like a magnet, he was just, he got to be a very skilled machinist and a good mind. There were many innovations and that type of thing. So his business was quite successful, really.
And did he employ other islanders there?
Yes, he did.
Robert Boner?
Robert Boner was one. When Robert was going to school at the time in Detroit, let's see, but many islanders would come in. They wouldn't necessarily be employed. Stanley Burns, who incidentally was a relative of I think they were half brothers or something like that, of Robert Boner. Oh God, it seemed like an endless track of islanders coming in. But yet they had that old Irish characteristic. If an islander come in, work stopped. It just stopped. So much so when I was young, I just wondered how they could get anything done. It just, because they might take a whole day off just visiting with somebody. And we had loads of work to do. And that didn't bother them at all. The people were more important. See, that's going back to that idea of family. Right. Family, 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 yeah. And people certainly, I suppose they received such a good welcome that we're coming back.
Yeah. So you got to meet and maintain friendships with several islanders.
Many
in Detroit.
Oh, the ones that were, for example, the seamen on the lakes, they often would dock in Detroit. Well, as soon as they docked, our home was where they headed for. So we had seen many of those people, yeah, just when we were growing up as young kids.
Yeah. Who do you remember from those that worked on the lakes?
Bill Green. There's a left. Offhand, I don't remember his name. Bill Green used to come very often. Now, he was related to the Greens. He was related to us. Through Bridget, Anthony's oldest daughter. She married a Green, White Dan Green. So the Greens were all, well, I guess it was all one big family, really. And I do remember Bill Green coming to our house. He was great with kids, but just terrorized us unmercifully. He'd give you a quarter and then take it back from you. And then give it to my sister, little sister. And then take it back from her and give it to me. Now that'd go on for a long time. But at the end of the day, each of us would wind up a quarter. Now a quarter would buy an awful lot of candy in those days. Let me tell you, it was a lot of money for a kid. Something like maybe $5 today, maybe more. It was just, yeah. So he was good in spite of his, yeah, I don't know what you call it, kind of a streak. He just liked to terrorize kids.
How young were you when you first, both of you first visited the island as children?
How young? Maybe about 6 years old first, because my dad came quite often. How old were you, Charlie?
Probably about 10 or 12.
Okay.
When I first came here.
Yeah.
And you would come in the summers?
He'd come any time of the year. Yeah. Any time of the year.
What's your first memory of the island, of seeing it as a child when you visited?
Quite interesting. I would get, from my dad's idea, I couldn't quite understand his enthusiasm. The place was nice and it was loaded with relatives, but I couldn't make any sense out of who they were. Although, God, some of them were awful nice. Just leave you terribly confused. But being a kid, see, about 8 years old, you don't fully understand what he's seeing in the people, because his idea of the island, that no place in the world existed like Beaver Island. See, his heart was always here. A place where you're secure, where people accept you. See, that was beyond me, my understanding at the time. And his idea of the people, they looked like ordinary people to me, but to him they were just perfect. I mean, if you ask him now, what could that person do to change? He couldn't find anything. I mean, they were just perfect. Now, I might add something interesting. It's been many, many years since I've been to Beaver Island, because I've had a lot of opportunities to go to Ireland, which I did. I've spent a lot of time in Ireland. And what attracted me about Ireland were the people, particularly in Donegal, and Erinmore, and Antory, that you were accepted right away. In fact, oftentimes they'd ask you, particularly when I was younger, how long are you home for? A very warm experience. Now, something that I've noticed on Beaver Island this time, my God, the people here have the same spirit. You see just kind of a freedom on their faces. That doesn't mean they didn't have problems. They do, like anybody. An acceptance, an openness. God, if you're walking, I mean, you can't walk down the street if you don't wave. I mean, everybody's waving at you. They don't know who you are, but they're waving. And you can feel that complete acceptance. Now, quite an amazing thing, really. I was only here 2 days with our function. Sunday morning, I went to the breakfast in the church hall. And for some reason, I just assumed I was in Ireland. I seen some fellow with an American flag on his back, and I says, my God, he come a long way. I just assumed like I was back in Erinmore. Strange. In other words, the people haven't lost that sparkle, that attractiveness, the helpfulness. And I've witnessed that same thing here today, or this time. So you can bet I'll be back many, many, many times, really. In fact, it's hard for me to leave, being retired now. It's quite a temptation to stay. Now that's a very deep thing you won't find in the city. If you ever, well, I know everybody's had an experience in the city. You're lost in the crowd. Here you can't get lost in the crowd. For example, and two, we built a big bonfire on the bank there. Now that's a swimming area for kids, and unfortunately we used it. Somebody brought a whole raft of pallets to burn. Well, those things are loaded with staples and nails. Well, I'm alarmed afterwards. You don't think of that in advance. But we had fire clearances and everything was safe that way. But hell, I mean, all those staples you're loaded in the sand. So I mentioned my concern to one of the islanders, to Roland Cowell, who I met at the breakfast. And he kept telling me, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. But I was worried about it. And my God, he brought a crew in that afternoon with magnets and metal detectors and cleaned up not only our section, but the whole beach. So the whole beach is better shape now than it was before. Now, I asked him, Roland, can I help financially with this? He says, absolutely not. You see, that's the spirit. See, that's something you'd never find in the city. Never, never, never. That's why, God, you feel like this is home. So that's getting sidetracked a bit, but it's worth mentioning.
Sure.
Worth that.
What are some of the memories from your childhood visits here that might stand out in your mind?
Okay, I remember specifically visiting old relatives, and also we visited an old man. You know, when my dad came, I don't think he missed hardly an islander in his visits. This was almost like a moral responsibility to him, particularly the old people that were living alone. One old man we visited, to show you kind of the bend of faith, in the simple faith, but sound faith. This old man reluctantly showed us, well, not really reluctantly, but he had been getting some criticism for what he had done. It was a family's practice on Easter Sunday morning to get a bottle of water from their well. Now maybe you've heard something about it, of this tradition. He'd take that bottle of water and cork it up, and then a day or two after Easter, he would get another bottle. And always the bottle collected Easter Sunday morning was crystal clear. And the bottle collected a day or two after was cloudy, which water will do if you know, it's got organisms in it. So to this old man, this was holy water. And somebody had criticized him for this, the old guy. That's why he was a bit reluctant, but he knew my dad would be open. So he asked the priest if it was holy water. The priest assured him it was holy water. What else could it be? It's the man's deep faith in Easter.
Sure.
So it was a simple faith, I think, that impressed me. Just a simple, we say almost childlike, but see, that's when miracles happen, with that simplicity. See, in complete trust. To him, it was holy water, and by God, it was as holy as any water you could get, really. So the people criticizing him, some other islanders says that's not holy water. You know, they were out on a step. That's all. Let's see what else, maybe. The openness and the goodness of people as a boy. I remember stopping at Joe Fro's Sandenberg, and his wife Bid made, at the time, what I thought, and still think, was the finest meal I ever had in my life. She asked us if we had eaten. Well, my dad, he wouldn't be too, I mean, he's visiting people. I mean, he just dragged me along, whether he ate or not. I mean, it didn't make much difference to him. He could go a long ways. I'm getting kind of hungry about 11:30. I says, no, we haven't eaten anything. And she made toast, just plain toast, and put a can of whole tomatoes on it. God, I kept asking her for more and more and more. To me, that was just gourmet food deluxe, and it really was. But I think part of it was Bid's attitude, see, the caring, the concern, see, just a lovingness come out. So let's see, any other people I know specifically? That made a big impression on me, let me tell you. The importance, see, of being open to people and being concerned about their welfare and all that. Offhand, I don't recall anything that was more than anything out of the ordinary than meeting people and getting confused with names. God, I think he'd give me the lineage, but rattled off, and like you probably find now, I mean, if somebody rattles off 3 or 4 generations, I mean, you're gone. Yeah.
Yes.
So how long did you continue to visit here?
Up until I was about 20. Yeah, quite a number of times. Now, Charlie's visited too. Charlie, maybe you can add to that.
Well, I remember staying at Bid Sandenberg's house and with Joe, and I really had an enjoyable time. And she was such a gracious person. You know, she was a wonderful cook, and she'd not only make you 1 pie, she'd make you sometimes 2 or 3 pies. So I mean, I picked up some weight here, and but I was intrigued a lot, like with the stories, you know, that you would hear, different stories, like one where I don't know what year this took place, but where a German priest, you know, sent out west to a German settlement and asked for volunteers, you know, to come to Beaver Island to show the Irish how to farm, because he couldn't stand the Irish being non-productive when they weren't fishing, because they were party people. So anyway, I guess the first generation German children, you know, watching the Irish children, jumped the fence. You know, of course, the ground here, the soil's not that productive, a lot of stone to clear and that kind of thing, and so it wasn't long before the German kids were partying with the Irish. And I thought that was a good story, and another one too. You know, as being a kid, I was intrigued, like, with stories about Indians. You know, so here I could meet Indians, and a fellow that chummed around or worked with Joe Mafro, and Joe Mafro had a little fishing business going, was Big William Wazigizik, and Big William had stories too, and he was a very nice fellow, but would talk more if he had a jumbo of beer. If he had a jumbo, he would do good, you know. And the same way with McFro, and you know, and McFro was always kidding around and joking. And one of the things, McFro, he wouldn't go to mass, you know. And so there was another guy with me who stayed there at Bid's house too for a while, and was always trying to convert McFro and tell him the advantages of going to church. And McFro would tell him, well, I can listen to it on the radio. And this kid was just exasperated, you know. And but another story that I remember that fascinated me when I was a kid that my dad related was my grandmother ran that boarding house, and there was an Indian lady who married a fellow, I believe, from New York City, and they settled over on Garden Island, and the fellow went a little crazy during the winter, and probably a real lot of cabin fever, and he tried to kill her. And she was suspicious of him, so she, in the meantime, he shot her, I think, 2 or 3 times. And anyway, she knifed him, she killed him. And she came walking across the ice and went to my grandmother's house and told her the story. Well, my grandmother set her down at the kitchen table and fed her, you know, put on a feed for her. And my dad said it was a fascinating thing just to watch her eat, because you could see this whole big hole.
Oh God! Oh God, Charlie! Do you have any more pleasant stories?
Well, I thought, you know, the hardship of the people. You know, I mean, you know, to be able, I was just, you know, a kid. You'd think, gee, you know, would you be able to do that? You know, I mean, that'd be a hard to walk across the ice. Then she left my grandmother's house and then walked across the ice to Cross Village, you know, for medical help. Now that's, I mean, that's a pretty strong lady to be able to do that.
God, yes.
Another one was Alex Cornstalk. You know, he was another one. He told some great stories, and but probably too, I was fascinated and taken up with the people, and I still am. Like with older people, sometimes you could see a great deal of in-depth character, like in their face, and that was Pat Boner. Pat Boner radiated to me a lot of love, a lot of caring. You know, he was something that, you know, I think if he never seen you before, you know, he could just open up his arms to you. You know, and he was always willing to give of himself and playing the fiddle. And I remember what I thought was awfully strange, you know, because like in normal households where we come from, like you're normally, as a kid, you're in bed by 9, at least by 10 o'clock. Well, gosh, here on this island, I remember going with my dad, and we go over somebody's house, and it might be 10 o'clock in the evening. Okay, and I remember one time Jules Gillespie came over with his guitar, and then Pat Boner came over, and my gosh, you were there all night long. And I mean, it was a nice party. I mean, it was a nice party, you know. And someone would recite a poem, or lots sing songs, and play, you know, and real good conversation. So I was fascinated with that as a kid. See, I never encountered that before.
Right.
You know?
They must have been quite a treat. I mean, to have come from the city and then you're here visiting and kind of stepping back in time.
Well, I was so intrigued with the place that when I got married, that my wife and I spent our honeymoon here back in 1961. We stayed at the lodge, and we were the only people in the lodge, you know. And so the proprietor at that time, I can't think of his name, he was a young fellow that, and him and his wife had 2 small children, you know. So anyway, they had the fireplace going in the lodge, which was very, very nice. And he set us up a table with candles and all that, you know. And that was good for one night that I asked him if we could eat in the kitchen. but his family, he said, yeah. So that was, I mean, that was good. I mean, very, very nice. I really enjoyed it. People were very hospitable. You know.
Charlie, what about the time you were here as a kid alone and you're running the money?
Oh, well, no, that was on our honeymoon.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, we got snowed in here. We couldn't fly out. And so anyway, my dad called, I think, Archie Lavender, you know, and Archie, there was a knock on our door, you know, and here was Archie with money. And he was a grand fellow too, him and his wife Frances. She was very gracious. You know, but we had stayed with the Lavenders too. I brought my 2 boys up, probably 15 years ago, and we walked all over this island, you know. But Archie, you know, we stayed with him, and he loaned us his truck, and so we had that for a while, and then Mary Burt loaned us her car, you know, and Archie got kind of a kick out of it because it was at night, and the roads were not marked, you know, and you could make a mistake and make the wrong turn, you know. So anyway, we were relating this to him, and one of my boys says, gee, yeah, you can get lost on this island. And he laughed. He got a big chuckle out of it. You get lost on the island. So that's what I remember mostly, was, and that was and I mean, impressed me, like, to come back from my honeymoon,
Yeah. So this has been a pretty important weekend for you and your family. The reunion.
Exactly. It's extremely warm. In fact, some of our group, they were all deeply moved at Beaver Island. And I would be very surprised if some of them never come back. I mean, everyone I talked to was just anxious to come back.
Yes, they were.
In fact, one of the fellows in the group, he married into the family. And I talked to him in the evening before he left. And now here's a man, and he's right at the verge of tears. He says he's never experienced anything like this in his life, in his adult life. In his life, period. Where people care about you. And God, what a profound effect on him. See, we're used to it. If people didn't care about us, they'd know about it, I think. But here's a grown adult, maybe in his 40s, who never in his whole life experienced anybody really caring about him. And here people paid attention to him. Quite a moving experience, I tell you. And he's a convert. Yeah. He wants to be part of the scene very, very, very much. Yeah. So I know he'll be back.
And some of the younger guys were talking even coming in the winter. I thought, wow,
That means they're hooked if they're starting.
Yeah. You talk winter, they're hooked.
Well, it's common for a lot of Americans to return to Europe or other areas to visit their ancestral homeland, but I think in a lot of ways, for literally hundreds and hundreds of people now, a return to Beaver Island is as important. It has that feeling about it, partly because time moves a little more slowly here, but it's also, I think, a pretty amazing thing, just watching this over the weekend, that thousands of people around this country can trace their lineage back to this small island.
Yes.
And from here back to another island, another few counties on the western side of Ireland. But it's very gratifying, I think.
Extremely so. And just to add a note to that, we just say thousands. Jim Sunke's in his database now has well over 13,000 people. 13,000 people from this island. Their extended families. And God, he's not near-ended.
No.
So it's amazing. See, the people got a grounding here. That's part of the Irish mission. And I think why God got them out of Ireland was so they could spread that influence to the whole world, to bring something special. And the Irish have that special thing. It's a mission for them. It happened in the early days of the church. When thousands and thousands of monks, see, after the Dark Ages left Ireland, right after St. Patrick was converted them. Within 100 years, see, they were sending thousands of monks to reestablish the monasteries and churches in Europe and educational systems, which was another big benefit of St. Patrick's coming. That's why the Irish, or God wanted the Irish to be converted. At the time, he was just too providential.
I think too, like, we know in this country, like, the family values are really diminishing compared to what they used to be like 40, 50 years ago. And I think that, this family reunion was a rekindling of the family values.
Oh, exactly.
And, you can't really put a price on that.
No.
So it was a very good experience. Very good.
Really, people want to know their roots. They want to know they belong. And until they do that, they're kind of a distracted, displaced person.
Yes.
Just alone. They're alone in the world until they can make that connection. So that's why it had such a profound effect, I think, on them. Here they knew, if they attended our reunion, they knew they belonged, no matter who they were. Yeah.
Well, we were glad to be a part of it, and glad that you came back here to celebrate.
Maybe I should add with one note here. I want to say that you have that spirit. You communicate it. People feel welcome with you. Well, I knew it the first time I seen you. I mean, you didn't have to say a word. I didn't know you belonged to the family, but I knew you had, that you were part of this community here, caring community. So I want to compliment you and thank you too, really, for all your efforts. Because this is quite a laborious job to try to piecemeal this thing all together.
Yeah, well, as one amateur historian to another, and as an Islander too, I appreciate what you're saying, and we appreciate your work too, and what you contributed here to
thank you
the
immensely.
society. And thank you both for speaking here with me tonight too.
Oh, thank you for your patience.
Yep.